Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming out today to the Gallery of Contemporary Art here at UCCS to hear our first gallery talk with 5 of our faculty artists. So I'm going to hand it over to them in just a second, but my name is Lene Cravens. I'm the Exhibitions and Events Manager here at GOCA, and it was amazing working with our faculty artists on the show. If you've had time to look at the show, you've probably seen how great the work is. But we're actually going to start in the back room with Clark's work, so let's mosey on back there so y'all can see Clark's work and he can tell us a little bit about it.
Well, hi everyone, my name is Clark Valentine. I'm an instructor here at UCCS. I teach painting, drawing, and 2D design. So I actually was a student here at UCCS, got my undergraduate degree here. I went out to Colorado State University in Fort Collins where I did my graduate program, and now back here teaching, which is great. My drawing practice, this is really kind of the heart of what I do. I also work collaboratively on a lot of works as well, but drawing is really kind of like the center foundation of my practice. And in my work, I'm thinking a lot about like the way that we can displace things that are ubiquitous in our life, right? And for me, that question starts with the pen, right? This is something that we touch every single day, right? We are so familiar with the marks that our hands want to make. And my formal question in my work is just really investigating the way that pen and ink works together, the way that the ink kind of flows out onto a paper, and how I can find maybe the natural flow that my hand wants to make. So I'll explain process first. I think this work explains it really well. What I usually do in these works, I start with a ruled line, oftentimes in the center of the piece. So just a single line kind of sliding across the edge of a ruler. And what I'm doing as I radiate outwards from that center mark, I'm trying to repeat the line before as exactly as possible. So I'm kind of inching my hand across the page, trying to mimic this ruled mark, something that's mechanical. And inevitably, my hand's going to make some sort of mistake. So in the third line, that mistake becomes accentuated as I try to repeat it, and then another mistake happens, and so on and so forth as I continue out. So what I'm thinking about, really in love with kind of the last line on the page. I give myself boundaries and I just kind of work out until I hit that border. And over this duration, my hand, like through this process of hyperfocus, slowly deteriorates into the mark that maybe my hand naturally wants to make. So I'm thinking a lot about, you know, if I came up to a blank sheet of paper and I wanted to place just a single mark and call it spontaneous, that's cognitively informed by what I think a spontaneous mark should be, right? I've seen calligraphy paintings, I've looked at Pollock. These marks wouldn't really be spontaneous. They would be me referencing other spontaneous marks. So instead, going through this process of trying to achieve like a mechanical mark and missing that I flow into this mark that my hand would have wanted to make. So this is me finding kind of a spontaneous mark that I couldn't achieve just by placing a single mark onto the surface. So each one becomes different, right? That top line and the bottom have a different effect. And this is just based on these unique moments, right? The way that my hand was moving, maybe interruptions in the pen, or like me having to adjust to the materials. Each of these small moments builds into something kind of bigger than the sum of all of its parts. So conceptually with my work, I'm really interested in the idea of ritual, right? We have rituals in our life. We can put that in maybe a spiritual context, but also just the way that we go through processes each and every day. We begin to habitualize certain things, right? Washing the dishes or driving your car, and things that were once maybe a place of focus, we lose that intensity to it. So this is kind of a practice of me bringing back that initial awareness of like the first moment that you experience something. So trying to be in quiet contemplation brings me to this point of just allowing there to be this perfect balance between, again, that hyper-intense focus, but also that flow state of responding organically and letting something just kind of build on itself in a really organic process. And as I find that kind of moment of balance, I can't control this, but usually every day in my studio I hit some sort of flow state. So I work most often in complete silence. I'm just trying to listen to the scratch of the pen across the paper. And I'm hoping to get into a flow state because you're starting the day, your back hurts, or you can't quite get concentrated. But as I'm working, I can't force that. And at some point, almost every day that I'm working all day, I just like hit this moment where I kind of lose sight of time. The marks start to become more natural. My hand's almost moving kind of its own accord, as opposed to me like consciously deciding something. And then before you know it, I set alarms at the end of the day, and my alarm goes off and tells me it's time to be done and go cook dinner, and I don't quite know where the time goes. I'm just really interested in like what is that state and what can we accomplish when we hit these like moments of flow. Yeah, thoughts, questions, comments, anything? Yeah.
It's kind of like a meditation.
Absolutely, that's what it is. Yeah, for sure. And meditation, right, can exist. Certainly we have this understanding of meditation, religion, but it happens every day, right? Like I mentioned, washing the dishes or driving your car. And we think of meditation as like this moment of like emptiness, right? You know, you're gonna sit down, you're gonna clear your mind. But really, when we look at most meditative practices, it's moving through that focus, right? That there's a mantra that's being repeated, or focusing on something specific about the self.
Bringing
and then,
back the focus is what made when you said that.
yeah, exactly. And we experience this all the time, right? So I mentioned driving the car. When you're 15 or 16 learning how to drive, right? You're really paying attention, you're trying to be careful, and all of your muscle movements are like, you're extremely conscious about this, right? You're trying to stay in your lanes. But as you become familiar with driving, you eventually get to this place where that hyper intense focus doesn't necessarily go away, but you learn to cope with that and slide through that into a place of emptiness. And then you hit those moments where you're driving, all of a sudden you're in your driveway, and you're like, did I run red lights on the way home? Not sure if there were stop signs. Did I go my normal route, right?
How did I get here?
Yeah, it's not that we lost that focus. It's just that we've slid into that flow state, right? Where maybe the consciousness is interacting with that in a different way. Mm-hmm.
Other questions for Clark?
When you're working, do you stand as you work? Do you raise the piece up and down?
Yeah, so I have a nice big drafting table that I say I was gifted, but I kind of stole in grad school, and you know, I can change angles from it. So, like in these pieces, they're just a little bit too long for me to reach across. So I work on it sideways, and this one you kind of see some of the changes in values. But I start in the middle and just kind of apply. That's more of a logistics thing, but I'm really thinking about like what is like the span of my movement, and how does that coincide the movement of the body with changes of like your breath, or how can a movement document not just physical space, but like your emotional or spiritual state of being in that moment. So each of these becomes like a specific document of me in that place and time. Yeah.
I noticed that one's darker than that one. Did you use a different pencil or pen?
So it's actually the same. This is just one layer where I went horizontal, and then this, after finishing the first layer of this, I turned it and I'm going two directions. So this kind of creates a more woven look. So this is just repeating that singular practice twice on the same sheet of paper. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Corey.
So labor is like a really big part of this.
Yeah.
I mean, and it points to process, I think. And of course, when you get look closely at them, you see the kind of crawl of your mark, and even sometimes when there's a little ink droplet or something, it's really interesting because of the different levels of experience. But I'm kind of curious as to how they land on a viewer without that kind of contextual knowledge about your process. Meaning, like there are references to fibers, you said weaving before, cartography and landscape. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think in some of my works, like that labor becomes extremely, transparent. I'm working on like some video pieces right now where it shows the drawing creeping across the screen in real time, right? So their eyes are moving in the exact same process as my hand. Here, maybe that time doesn't come through, and that's where like the imagery that I've chosen, I'm hoping to maybe replicate that experience of slowing down, right? So when a viewer comes to this, right, these kinds of flows, the vibrations of the piece, I think cause this like moment of like stopping, right, trying to unpack it. And especially like in solo shows, the way that I try to help curate the space is I'm thinking about the way that the body moves throughout a space as well, right? Some of these demand a closer experience of looking, while other pieces ask a viewer to kind of pull away. So this awareness of your own body as you look at these pieces, especially in their relationship to one another, becomes pretty interesting, right? That you have to be present or mindful of this experience of movement, both for yourself, whether or not you're directly seeing that experience of movement for me. Yeah.
And so does that, do you think that connects, I mean, in terms of their feeling like a map, I mean, like, I don't know, like, does that, I don't know what I'm trying to get at here other than the
They're
kind
like typographic.
and they have a topography to them.
Mm-hmm.
there's almost something geologic about them because of it, right? There's even like looking at, especially the right one, both the top and the bottom look like horizon lines. And so there's almost like geologic sense of time in them as well, because of it's the most, I mean, I know you're not so much interested in its pictures, more about process and objects.
But I think it's really, I'm always interested in like finding like these visual references that folks make with the work. So like, I grew up riding horses, and I think of like riding through the field of like really tall grass, and when the wind's moving, you can see the placement of this pressure change because of the waves in like really tall grass out in the middle of an empty field. And it's like, you're seeing the effects of maybe like a more intangible movement. So this, you know, again, with this, that idea of documentation, each of these ripples is like an effect of some sort of, some sort of disturbance or like change in the way that my movement is going, right? Moments of organic disruption.
Yeah, interesting.
Well, thank you so much,
Yeah,
Clark. It was great to hear more.
Appreciate it.
Do you have questions after this? We can ask them after.
I am interested in storytelling, and I'm also interested in what we don't know about the stories that we've been told. And so all of these is, I'm not going to be able to talk this articulately because this is the very beginning of a new body of work. And so these are the first, successful, in my mind, images that I made from it. There are a bunch of other ones that I thought were going to be great, and then they weren't. And that's disappointing, but it happens. And these are about my mother right now. And my mother has passed 9 years ago. She died 2 months after my daughter was born. My daughter is in this photo. And my mother was Filipino, and some of the things that I'm wrestling with are the stories that I've been told in my life that I don't know their veracity, and making you question your own, like the stories that you have been told, that you did this thing that you don't remember doing because you were like 5 or 4 or 6 or whatever, but there's a retelling in it, and so you have to trust what you've been told until you get to like your 40s, and then you start questioning what you've been told. And these are about stories. 2 of them are about stories that I've been told, and one of them was about a belief, I guess. And so I didn't say it in the statement, and so I'll tell you the stories now. The first one, I don't know if anybody knows a lot about Filipino culture, but they're obsessed with death. Death rituals and burial rites, and there's a lot of kind of what I call voodoo Catholicism involved in death rites and funeral rites in the Philippines. And they're wildly different based on provinces. There's a lot of different provinces in the Philippines. And my mother had told a story about living with her grandmother the first several years of her life. She had scarlet fever, and her parents sent her up to go live with her grandparents because they couldn't deal with her because she was sick. And she lived there for several years. She thought her grandparents were her parents, and then they came and got her when she was like, whatever, 8 or 9. And then she was living with her real parents in Manila. And anyway, the grandmother died when my mother was about 12. And she told me is she had to sit in a room wearing a red dress, holding vigil with the body alone for 24 hours, overnight, and I was like, oh, that's really scary, really creepy. And I don't have anyone I can ask, because part of the problem of these stories is that my mother kept the Filipino side of our family like really locked down, in the sense that I don't really know much about it. And she kind of had a clan with her immediate family that wasn't really shared with the family that she made, either biologically or like married into. And so I didn't know, when I was wanting to make this photograph, I was like, I don't really know about, so I started, does this really happen? Is this really a funeral rite? And so I started researching, and out of about, I don't know, 28 different funeral traditions, there's one where children wear red. And the children wear red to ward off the possibility of seeing ghosts. And so what I've also learned is she probably wasn't alone in the room with the body for 24 hours. And there's other things going on. In the ritual, the body probably was laid out, like on a table. Traditionally, there's like novenas said for 8 days because people are coming from all over and traveling like really hard rural roads to get to somebody. But I made this photo, and I also got things wrong, and I kind of love that, as it just emphasizes the idea of what we don't know. I didn't know what color the dead wear. And so I started looking for that, and I couldn't find it until after I already made this photograph and spent all this money on this production of this image. And then I started Googling, like, you know, Filipino funeral of a woman or something, and certain views, and I was like, oh, they wear white. They're all wearing white. So I got that wrong too. My daughter is 9 years old, and I situated her, the room is completely dark except for these candles, like the little Roman candles. And I also like the idea of not trying to make a faithful recreation of whatever Cebu province looked like, you know. I mean, this is my living room, you know, and these are the Roman Catholic candles that you can buy from the Luna store. Is it called Luna? The Mexican place on Academy. So there's like a place where you can buy these for $3 instead of paying $20 for the Poor Richards. And I set up the camera and took several shots, you know. So these are about 2-minute exposures. So those of you who see the blur in my daughter, like, that's pretty good for a 9-year-old for 2 minutes. And I'm pretty happy with it. I had to do some little, like, you could actually, if you come up close, you can see through my body, because I actually had to get up and turn off the camera. And so in 2 minutes, like, mostly you stay still, but if you look closely, you can see that I'm transparent, which also is kind of cool because it references the ghost. Maybe I'm a ghost. And we had funny little conversations while we were doing this. She's like, how do you feel like pretending you're dead on our table? And I was like, I don't know, don't talk. She said, no one can see me, I'm facing the back. And I was like, okay. So that is that story and that photograph. This story also related to death. And it is what you think it is. It's the same, my daughter in a car top carrier on a Subaru. When she first came to the United States when she was 19, and married my father very young, she called her family in the Philippines. This is a story I've been told by both of them, my father and my mother. She called her family in the Philippines, and she said, everything in America moves so fast. Everyone is going everywhere so fast. They don't have time to bury their dead. They just put them on top of their cars and go. And my dad said, what are you saying? And then he had to clarify what those were, and that they are not, in fact, coffins, and we do not carry our dead with us everywhere. But that kind of cultural slippage and assumptions, and kind of projecting your own culture without knowing you're doing it onto a new cultural context that you just entered, is kind of profound. And I don't know, the photograph was really fun to make. She was worried about neighbors seeing us doing this, and like I had permission. So that is the story of that image. The last image, and I know that most of you know if you've read it, it's an AI-generated image. I fed Midjourney a reference image. You can do that with Midjourney, so I gave it a photograph of my mother and myself and 2 neighbors sitting around a table, like talking, and my mother's smoking, and they're drinking wine, and I feel privileged to be let in by the grown-ups because I was like 16 in that picture. So they basically, Midjourney uses it as stage blocking, basically. So they basically created a little bit of like what the photo, where people were, but that's the only thing that it used. I did say, with a prompt, I think I put the whole prompt in there. Yeah. Fantasy demons fighting a hyper-realistic angel next to 4 segregated women that are talking and laughing. Photography by Ryan McGinley, no blur, version 4, aspect ratio 3.2. You know, I think, I said sci-fi too. Sci-fi fantasy demons. And the segregated women is really just actually prompt speak for saying they are separate from one another and they are not demons themselves. I don't mean like that they're racially segregated or anything like that. That's just when you read the little books about how to write, booklets about how to write the prompts, that's what they say is how you get people who aren't stuck together. Or like, you know, somebody who, I got several where like the person was turning into a demon, you know, and I wanted them just to be a person sitting at a table. So these photos are related to the fact that my mother and I grew up, they were evangelical fundamentalist Christians, and they were really wacky and extreme in their beliefs in my early adolescence. And my mother believed that she could see demonic warfare happening around us all the time, which I would think would be really complicated, yeah, if you were to see that and scary. So I wanted to make a picture of something impossible. And so I'm just playing with the recently, you know, available to us AI platforms to do that. So that's everything.
Yeah. Well, we have time for just like 1 or 2 questions if anyone has a question for Stacy. about her images or comment.
I just said I think it's awesome.
Oh,
I didn't think of this, or I didn't notice it when I saw this last, but the Subaru or the car is cut off and it's striking. And I wondered if that was, I mean, I know it's not accidental, I assume. It just...
No, I mean, I took a lot of photos, and this is the full frame.
Yeah.
You know, so I didn't crop anything out. I did do a little bit of like post-processing, but my idea with Photoshop and stuff is don't make it look like it's been through Photoshop, you know, so like I choned down some reflections, you know, and some things like that, but not really, you know, sharpened a little bit, which you're supposed to do with every image anyway. Blurred the trees in the background a tiny bit, like 2 on the Gaussian blur, you know, so just little things. I liked I think out of all the pictures I took, I probably took 100 or something, that I just liked the composition of this one the best. And I liked the way that she was photographed and the way that, you know, the angle that I got it at. So that's why I don't think, you know, you're not always thinking about everything in the composition, but yeah, now that you pointed it out, I'm thinking about it.
Those two themes seem to work together, and also the scale, I'm sure, too. So she's not like a tiny thing in the distance.
It was good because a full adult couldn't fit in that. Like, it became very apparent, and there's also a weight limit on them, which she's not at, so that's convenient. But anything else?
awesome. Well, thank you so much, Stacy.
I am also faculty here, and this is year 10 for me. Just this semester. I've been here 10 years, so it feels great. I don't sound convincing. I actually feel like it feels amazing. It really feels wonderful. You learn a lot from teaching, and then you feel so lucky just to have encountered all these young people in the process of learning, and that's really an honor. So I don't know. I feel psyched about it. Okay, so these 3 pieces, if you read the text, I can say that probably the most unifying principle for me was the paper. Also, they're all my hand, I suppose. They're all gouache drawings, and on paper, and on this particular paper that I just wanted to stretch out a little bit. Gouache is a form of watercolor. It's a variant that is opaque. Similar to how, you know, acrylic or oil paint is opaque. So it has the capacity to be opaque, but then you can also dilute it so that you can have washes that have translucency also. So I love playing around with gouache. It's just so fun. And yeah, it's typically, you're working at a scale like this because watercolor paper is not cheap, and it's just a whole different animal. And so, I was on medical leave last year. The first half of the year, I had long COVID for exactly 6 months, from February to July, August. And I don't know, it was like life just sort of got real small, and life got real quiet, and it was me at my table painting out some ideas. I typically work with text, not always. I think of myself as a writer in visual terms, and sort of I'm really excited about the cusp of like where does written language stop and visuals begin, and like where's the overlap, and this sort of point of tension between those 2 modes. So in a way, that's the some of the content of this work, or maybe it's more of the mode. And what I see of these, I'm only learning of these, if you will. Similar to what Stacy was saying, it's like when you're at the beginning of something, and I don't know if this is a beginning of something, it's a continuation, and I think it's maybe just a little encapsulated thing, but they came out of this feeling like I was entirely on the other side of human life, the art of society, and of relating to myself as a self. And so it was like, I had gone through divorce with children, which I do not recommend. And just between that happening and then pandemic, it was like, I came out of that, and then long COVID, it was like, gosh, I don't know who that person I used to be was exactly, and I don't think I am that person. And so, like agnosticism, for example, this is partly a joke for my homies here in Colorado Springs. And it's also, you know, how art has a lot of layers, right, typically. And if you make things, you don't need to be told this, but your art will have 5 or 6 or 7 sort of things going on. It's never about a certain thing, one little tiny thing, right? So agnosticism is not about a comment, it's not limited to a comment or a question about religion per se, however that is a layer. It's also the belief system of the self, the belief and the durability of the self as a self. And so this is also partly like, well, what if you don't know? And what if you're just like a stream, there's part of this that is a little bit like emotional. So I would say like, just the like being comfortable with loss and being comfortable with like, more than comfortable though, like ecstatically grateful to have even like had this ride down the stream. And that's kind of where I find myself. To be honest, I find it that way. So these are like, when I look at them, I think now it's like sort of hallmarks in my life, and looking at hallmarks from my life as a person who died in a way, and is looking at emblems of that life. You know what I mean? So yeah. I don't know what more to say. I feel super psyched with these. I feel I'm very happy that I made them, and hopefully we love our art. Hopefully we love our own art. And even if it's like a bit, like these, I have to say, especially the hand, it felt embarrassing. I was embarrassed with that one. And I also love it, and it's a bit bad. But what embarrassed me was the folksiness of it. And because, I guess to brag too much, but I'm really good at drawing the human form, and I don't generally draw the human form. And this isn't me live drawing the human form, sort of working a little bit with the found reference. And then there's part of me that's like, I started judging the lines, and I was like, did it kill the life of this drawing? And anyway, like self-judgment can creep in, and yet I couldn't be happier with it now. I'm just so psyched that it exists. Happy with it. Anyway.
Thank you so much, Marina. Does anyone have any questions for Marina?
I do. I don't know why, out of everything on the hand one, what drew my eye to it the most was at the very bottom. I think one said like the something part and the other part. The two at the bottom.
It's the stupid part and the secret part.
Yeah, and I was just curious about that, because like obviously, I mean, it looks like you're giving yourself a palm reading, right?
Yeah.
And which is, but I thought it was just interesting, the stupid part. I guess I was just curious, like, where that came from, because it seems...
That's a key question, because I didn't really talk about this. Like, the whole operation for it is to try to create a fortune that would be true for everyone. Like, what kind of fortune, what is, like, in the story arc of a human life? What do you actually encounter? And what if every single person had their palm read by this palm reading, that's a protocol or whatever, like, would it be true? And I feel like there's nobody whose lives don't have stupid
Oh,
things
stupid,
in it
yeah.
that is done to you and by you and around you. And,
Yeah.
yeah, and then the secret part, this is a side note, but I was trying to embed things in all of these that are not Instagrammable, if you will.
Yeah.
And like that one has a few things, but those two things, those are part of it.
Yeah.
But it's also the reflectivity, because it's like a saturation of graphite that becomes reflective, and that doesn't photograph correctly. And then they just all have things hidden in them that, like, if you weren't there, you wouldn't catch it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really curious about, first I'm glad you came to really love that piece, because I do too.
I'm so glad.
I think it's fantastic. And I'm really curious about there's like really kind of 3 levels of representation, it seems to me, in these, at least 3. Like the pictorial, the kind of illustrated object that's recognizable, and then language that is both an object and we see through it, and then also abstraction. So I'm kind of curious about those, like you're interested in these 3 different ways, modes of working, and how they, in each case they, the first one maybe has less abstraction, and then you can maybe more abstract as they move to the right, but they all have it to an extent. Yeah.
That's a cool question, I like that. And I feel like this cloud right here is this bit of like, it needed to be there, or maybe all of those clouds. Well, I also oil paint and I love color, but I took my 11-year-old skating recently, a couple weeks ago, and every time I go back to the rink, I am reminded why my art looks the way it does. So I grew up figure skating 20 hours a week as like a small child. And so to me, it's like, oh yeah, it's the lines under the ice, and it's the quiet and the speed, and like things that Clark was saying, like about like just the sound of the pen. Like I grew up drawing circles in ice with skates and listening to the sound and just the quietness of that. So that's definitely a mode, but it's also like every place I've been, like that has San Francisco in it, and I don't know, and they all have LA in it, I think. Yeah. And I also miss oil painting, and I don't have a studio for that right now, so I'm probably just like getting a little bit of angst out, trying to make gouache be oil paint for a second.
Well, that poetic way of working you kind of talk about as a writer, I mean, I feel like these are very poetic in that way too, that they're not, like intention is not always the important part of that, right? You're guided by some intention, but also discovery, and putting things together in unusual ways that just kind of seem or feel right, and that lead to different discoveries, and maybe it leads you back to yourself and some of the parts of yourself that you, that's been my experience at least.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, conscious things also get.
Yeah.
You may or may not see later. Like I'm kind of just looking at where the stupid part and the secret part are. They're where you would slash your wrist if you were suicidal. Like, and so I was kind of like concentrating on that while you were talking about what those were, and how we kind of might be inclined to think that, if you're in that state of mind.
Yeah, no doubt. I think that I was looking at manuals, and I think this is called the Cups of Life, if I remember correctly. And I tried to keep it kind of true to what each line stands for something in poem reading. I think that's called the Cups of Life.
Well, thank you so much, Marina. We're gonna.
Excellent.
Thanks so much.
Hi everyone, my name is Henning. I'm a visual art tech here at UCCS, and I made these pieces. I view it as kind of a singular body of work. Not really sure why. Just kind of tires have been interesting to me for a long time. I like the kind of the way they're just kind of viewed as, like a secondary element, a hassle. It's not something that you want to deal with. You've got a flat tire, you have to deal with it. But there's just something really beautiful, I think, about like the tread patterns that they've come up with. This is a very simple tread pattern. I was looking through lots of patterns for tread patterns, and they're nuts. So part of this comes to thinking about my father. He owned a service station when I was a child, and so I have lots of memories of being there when I was a kid and seeing him change tires and plug holes, and then outside the I guess the main room you'd come in to pay for your gas or whatever, they had tires like propped up, and being smaller than this guy, I would just like endlessly like run back and forth on this little ledge just looking at these tires. So that's a lot of it. And then beyond that, just like the process, I really enjoy process-laden work. So the layers involved in building out these, and the process involved of figuring out how this was going to work with laser cut, which is just like my problem-solving exercise. I just really enjoy that. Additionally, the cardboard versions, I liked that it's got a lot of the same materials that are in tires. So there's fiber, there's wax, which is not an ingredient in tire. There's also carbon black, which is another ingredient in tires. I liked how that related to this, where what's left over is kind of this burned out remnants of the encaustic in the wood. You're kind of like creating carbon as you're making the piece. That's what I got. You guys have any questions?
Yeah. I'm curious why you titled it Rest.
So I liked, and then for my artist statement, I just found a definition of rest, and then adjusted it a little bit, made it a little ambiguous in parts, and then a little more pointed in others. Tires are viewed in rest, right? You just see them in rest. I also liked that rest can be termed for like what's left over, what remains. So both these pieces are like kind of like what's left over after the process is finished, kind of the leftovers. And then rest, of course, is death as well, the eternal rest. But I was just thinking, like, I wanted something that was, I don't know, a little more open-ended than Goodyear or Assured or something like that. I also liked that they were the assurance tires, so like rest assured was another way I kind of thought about that whole setup.
I love your use of the encaustic wax, which is this really ancient medium. Like I think about the Etruscans, those beautiful like coffin pieces and other paintings. And so applied to this kind of contemporary object that we all, every few years have to deal with and forget about. I always forget about, and then someone says, these are terrible, you're going to die. But it makes me pay attention to the text, and especially the assurance, like if they're trying to make you feel really great about buying this particular product, and then referring to kind of the recycle aspect of it, but that all the different pieces, you would never make a tire this way.
Right.
So this deconstruction, and you're kind of obliterating the tire. And I think about the piece that you did a few years ago was also kind of this obliteration. I guess that's more of the observation, but the softness of the wax and the surface. If I didn't know, I don't think I would recognize it as cardboard if I hadn't seen you making them.
I like how you mentioned when you were talking about the process and kind of the like carbon and the connection to tires, but another thing about especially the two on the left is the smell that's very like potent with laser cutting, but I also think about the smell of rubber when you are in a tire shop. So it's not the same smell, but I like that kind of like other sensory effect with the work that you feel with the subject matter as well.
Yeah, you definitely get a sense of it as you come close to it. That'll eventually kind of fade, but yeah, it's very fortunate to have a nice, airy sculpture building to work in rather than trying to do this in my home studio.
I have a trivial question, but first just a comment on all the materials. It just all seems so cohesive with your description of your dad's shop, because that is like a place of care and repair, and it's just really neat. And I enjoy that. I'm glad to know that. I have never looked at the Goodyear logo before, like So I appreciate having having a good reason to stare at it. And I'm wondering, which I've never noticed, is that like a winged victory or something? Is that a foot?
Yeah, it's supposed to be a foot.
That's a foot with the wing, like
Yeah.
Nike, right?
Yeah.
Or Hermes, right? Or is it Hermes? Gosh, okay. All right. That's so, it's like mythic.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, going fast. That's so fun. That's so neat.
So I'm really interested in like this overlap between like design work and then like temporary functionality, and I think you're hitting on that. Not only, you know, with this design of the tire, with the materials you're using, right? There's these designers that like sit and think about like corrugation, you know, just the way that a box can be constructed, even though it's only for, you know, the temporary use of like Amazon getting this package to your doorstep and then it's discardable, recycled or not, right? Then we forget about it, wondering, yeah, what are your thoughts on that about like, how do you participate in that conversation as an artist, right? You know, you're thinking of design for a purely functional purpose, but there's like aesthetic choices that are being made within this.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's complicated, but.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I was definitely thinking too about, what, I knew I wanted to make these tires, and I was like, probably these are kind of like, you know, so that kind of limits what you're able to work with and start with. And actually, these are all from old Dick Blick boxes. We got a bunch of chairs in school. Like, sliced these all up and made these out of it. But yeah, just thinking about single-use packaging and art that's single-use, you know, the piece I made for the last show, the picture of it that I like best is when it's in the dumpster, you know, because it's, you know, you just can't hold on to everything. And so thinking about like, how could I shorten the carbon footprint of making them smart? Like, well, instead of buying new material, let's find some material that's on its way to being repurposed and recycled anyways.
Well, thank you so much, Nick.
Well, thanks, everyone.
I'm Claire. I'm also an instructor here at UCCS, and I teach assisted by Nick and Professor Matt, who I think their talks are
March 15th.
Just give a plug for that, and also Corey's speaking about his work too. But so we work kind of across there in the sculpture studio. So I teach kind of 3D foundations and welding and stuff like that. So yeah, really new work. I want to thank Lene for immense amount of patience as I came in with bits and pieces. I'm pretty excited. None of them have fallen apart because it's my first time doing a lot of 3D printing of this size. And I got started with that because I think, you know, Marina going through COVID was really difficult. And I think as not just as an artist, but as a person, but trying to get back to the world of making, it seemed like it was totally worthless and unimportant compared to people who had died and were so sick, and Trump, and I mean, I could keep going, George Floyd, on, right? So it just seemed really ridiculous. So I forced myself to go to beautiful Snowmass and take an Anderson Ranch workshop with an artist that I have followed for a while, Grace Lee Lawrence. And she is one of the few people that I feel is using 3D printing not to make some like craptastic piece of plastic that really just like give to someone for a Christmas present, or it just kind of sits there and becomes a tchotchke, but is using them in kind of larger scale ways that I feel is part of contemporary practice of sculpture today. So I found out she was teaching this class at Anderson Ranch, and decided to take a week-long class, and then decided to buy a 3D printer. And then now, I mean, if you had asked me a year ago, I would just be like, you know, you're crazy. So typically I'm more of a fine woodworker. I do a lot of steel stuff, really, you know, carve wooden chain by hand, you know, or with a router for 2 years. That's more kind of my style. So this is really radical. I love working with color, but typically it's not as Miami as we're seeing here. I really wanted to reference the body in each each of these and try to use some of the way that the programs work. You scan an actual object into mesh and then use a program called Rhino to then kind of move it around, which I don't really understand. It's a total disaster. And then output it to your 3D printer. And so I'm really interested in the role that replication has, the way that you can stack and absorb different objects. This piece here is really inspired by that Magritte painting and the sculpture with the female torso over and over again, kind of stacked here. So all of these objects kind of that I start with are actually real objects that I've scanned and manipulated in some way, and then I didn't want them to stay in the virtual world, at least, you know, maybe later I'll find the metaverse is a better place, but not yet. But trying to incorporate these into kind of larger, also hand-built pieces. So I really like the blobbiness of some of these forms, and where I kind of like mess up some stuff, and there's like, I don't really like that part about the cracks, but that you can still see my hand kind of in there. These kind of dough, like this doughy-like epoxy stuff, which I just kind of found out about. But still utilizing the hand in combination with this machine going, like drawing layer by layer, pooping out this little bit of plastic here. PLA is recyclable, but still plastic. So I kind of wrestle with, I guess, what does that mean to use it in sculpture? I don't know. I'm uneasy. I feel uneasy looking at the pieces. Hopefully you do too. Hopefully they're vaguely sinister, but then they also are tactile and you want to touch them and stroke them and lick them and eat them. They, I think, have a lot of movement to them, and yeah, maybe kind of eerie too. Definitely influenced by the fall of Roe v. Wade, and quite a lot of questions about bodily autonomy from like public health kind of issues about vaccines, and then also like what, where and when should people be allowed to make medical decisions for themselves. And I think I'm left maybe with less convictions and more confusion at the end of the day. And I use my work to kind of, I think, excavate through that. Color, I mean, that's still like really, almost like burns my eyes out, and I really like that. And I think formally, Michaela Steen said some really awesome things about my work. So trying to really play with a lot of formal aspects of composition and material, but then also have kind of a fun yet horrific message or meaning kind of behind it. So my friend Skip said, "I don't get it. I don't get it at all." I was like, "That's okay, Skip. Can you tell that like those are boobs and like that could be a vagina and like that's kind of a weird penis condom thing?" He said, "Yes." I was like, "Just think about that." For a while. But there's something about removing body parts from the body and then mutating them that asks questions about body modification, and I think like transition between gender and that fluidity, and how that is so much kind of a cultural warfare right now, and really a political issue as well too. And I'm just not sure. I have a lot of different thoughts everything about it all. This piece, I just want to tell you, this is called Anyways, because my mother-in-law, anytime she wants to change the conversation, she'll say, "Well, anyways," meaning I ignore everything that you're saying and move on to this. So a lot of the titles have to do with like kind of recent like situations I've had in the past kind of couple years. And yeah, any questions? questions or observations, I'd be happy to hear. The work is really new. I mean, it literally got finished the day before the show opened.
I just have one quick observation. This is giving off a strong femininity vibe to this piece. And I do have a question about the pedestal for your Magritte / vagina / it also looks like your canal. How did you decide on that for the base? I mean, I'm sure it's deliberate. It's very disco. And what does it say about the rest of the work?
I felt that piece needed to push back, and the best way it seemed to do that was a mirror, like that it would just kind of bounce off. I don't like the base at all. In fact, Lene is going to be taking the base home with her once the show is over.
I do love disco, so
because I feel that it doesn't quite work, and I'm not really sure. But I'm really using those pedestals to try to not only talk about like minimalism and geometry, but also make the pieces kind of taller and bigger.
They have another association of like when you go in dressing rooms in department stores, and you have those 3 mirrors. There's something that's like, I don't know, it's reminding me of that, which is a strong female for those dressing rooms with that light.
Was department stores part of this at all? And I'm okay. Will you humor me a take on this side? Because I see this as like the balls that they hang off the chalk.
Oh yeah,
truck nuts.
But also as a child's toy where it's a runner.
Like at the doctor's office.
In the doctor's office where a bead goes across, like an object of play. Anyway, I see this as Bullock's Wilshire in Los Angeles, and then I see this as it's like got mirrors everywhere. It just feels like place, that factors in. Like this whole world is such a mystery to me. It's intriguing.
There's something cool over here too with the mirrors. I'm catching yellow from the other one and from this. So it's sad that you're going to change it, but I'm also curious to know what you would change it to if she's going to redo the base for you. Are you just going to let her go with it, or do you have something in mind?
I'm just not sure, but that isn't right. Doesn't feel quite right.
I always like that as an artist, like that when something's done or doesn't quite, and you're like, okay, no, it's cool, but it's not doing what I needed to do for this piece. Because I think it's really cool, but Claire definitely has the final say on what makes sense for her work. So
I also think that when you procrastinate and you wait until December to make a show, and then you go on Wayfair and you're like pedestals, that there is a certain limitation that you have to get stuff done.
Including color though, did that? You must have painted them intentionally. The primaries.
So secret. So I got the pedestal, and then I kind of put it just like would just fall over. So it's full of styrofoam. It's so light. I had to cast a plaster like. Yeah. Oh, they don't tell you about that. So, it still is pretty tip-tastic. So just be careful.
it's fairly stable. I've had to lift it and move it a couple of times, and it's pretty stable. Yeah. I mean, no one should back into it, but it's. Well, I want to thank Claire. Thank you so much. That's great.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming. Hey, Dee. Well, I didn't prepare a huge, heavy, loaded artist statement to deliver today about the tall hats, but thinking about past work of mine, I've done a lot of installation art that's interactive, inviting viewers to navigate spaces, climb up into things, interact with all kinds of different contraptions, and part of the attraction of that kind of work is giving the viewer a sense of agency, a sense of crossing that boundary between the art object and, you know, themselves. So thinking that maybe there's a slight butterfly effect of some sort where it invites people to think and act and feel agency in other situations, you know, outside of the gallery setting. In kind of a funny way with a lot of that work, I always thought of it as like these big art installations that are impossible to sell. So I'm not being a capitalist. That felt good. And then also offering this experience to people to where they can, you know, interact and engage with the artwork. Always felt a little bit like a bit of activism, because my work isn't overtly activist in nature, but I felt like just that part of it had a little sense of that. So the hats fit in with a lot of that work, and just inviting viewers to feel, yes, you're allowed, put these on, and you can like take up space. You can be sort of a bothersome kind of figure in a crowded room if you want. The whole idea started at dinner with, my son was 8 at the time, and we were joking around about the tallest hats possible for specific places that we go in our lives, like the grocery store, and just how ridiculous it would be, and wondering if people would get annoyed by it, even though you're not doing anything wrong and you're not really taking up any more of their space. It's just your space above your head. And thinking about restaurants, like, oh, okay, favorite restaurant. We could go in, make hats specifically for the height of that ceiling that are like, these are hats we wear there. And we thought it was a hit. We were laughing about it enough that then for the faculty show, I always try to do something kind of new, playful, something where I play around with different materials and different processes, just because I think of it as like also connected to teaching and things that would help, you know, processes in the past. It's been like experimenting with rubber molds, and I don't know what last one would have been. That was kind of a mess with mechanical like self-portraits that were hurting themselves. That was more therapeutic for me. But anyway, so what I write about in here is ridiculous. I was just reading it, and it was a lot about freedom and liberty, and like this whole idea that like, when does it become impractical to fully express what you can, you know, within our laws or our amendments? And it just kind of felt like, to me, I don't know, the rhetoric is all over the place in a lot of different ways. It's really, oh God, pretty annoying sometimes, about just like, well, that's my right, you know, I have the right to do this. Doesn't mean you should do it, you know. So the hats were a little bit of like a impractical, to a point where they actually kind of, they don't really work. It kind of hurts your neck. They're really hard to wear. And I think for me, I started to see little connections with things in our society that maybe just because we have an amendment for it, I guess I'm going to dance around Second Amendment stuff where it's like, it's my right, you know. It's like, yeah, I know it is. But do you have to fully put it in my face and, you know, like put me in danger? But these are kind of a harmless, fun, playful way of like exploring that, maybe. None of this can go on. I don't want to become a target. Second Amendment rights people.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Have you ever been arrested wearing one of your hats yet?
No. I mean, I've worn them just around behind the sculpture studio over there, checking them out when I first made them, and then in my own yard.
Not in a restaurant yet?
Here. Haven't taken them out into the world yet. It's a little, I don't know if I can, you know? I'm a little self-conscious about it. It's like a fun idea. But then I also like, I don't want to draw all this attention myself. I don't know. Pretty low-key person. Try to just like blend in. You like that, Claire? Yes.
The red on the left.
The red is just part of the verb. Like there's kind of an underlying layer there. But some people had commented that they really liked that it gave it some kind of like bodily sense to it. A little bit of that, like, I don't know, the fur, maybe going towards more of the animal, maybe some kind of, what do you connect with it? Pagan, something going on there, a little more visceral. What do you think about the red? What were you?
It looks like someone got stabbed.
Oh, yeah? Huh.
Unicorn horn.
Oh, like that was remnants of someone else getting attacked by the hat. Okay. Yeah.
Why specifically fur instead of like colorful, like bone shape and whatnot?
Good question. I was also going just for them to function as objects that I liked as like sculptural forms. And so the texture things, I was gonna put a shout out to Mill Outlet. If anybody's not familiar with it, you have to go there and check it out. It's one of the last mom and pop stores in the world. But they're really great. And I was there, I was going through all of it. I had a giant pile of potential materials. At first I was thinking like a really thick felt that just seemed really nice, and making like sort of something that seemed like that's a real hat. That's like a traditional kind of thing. But then 15 years ago I saw the fur in there, and I've been waiting for an excuse. So it really just went on like the aesthetic qualities of it. But I don't know, what do you think they give, what does the fur give the hat?
Innocence.
A little.
It's not as colorful, but it's still not powerful.
A little bit of stuffed animal.
I would immediately to historical references and beavers.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of relates to some. I think I have a rabbit hat. It's really warm, functional. Yeah.
It's unusual, it's playful. They're playful with the fur, I think. Whereas if you had done felt or something more traditional fabric, we would have been more in line with like, and they function strongly as objects before you understand that they're hats.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a little less formal.
I walked in a little late, so forgive me, but I was curious how you bridged tall funny fur hats to guns and whatnot, but may I take a guess?
Yeah, sure,
like
go for it.
Because I'm going to be Matt for a second. Was it like, I can wear this, and there's the thrill of like, potentially this could go on to like crazy lengths, like look how tall and inconvenient and basically antisocial my thing could, like this could be, something like that? Or?
Where it at some point becomes burdensome to yourself and others.
Yeah. I love that friction of like, where does my freedom mess with your freedom to not be like sitting next to a big tall actor?
It almost seems silly to even be talking about like a concept that big with like this tall furry hats, but
something weighty and stuff.
Yeah.
Well, maybe people need to become more aware of each other, and if we all wore tall hats, and we could be aware of other people's needs.
Find my wife in the grocery store, just like looking over
Cool, thank you so much, Matt. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to stick around after and ask more questions about the hat. But thanks so much.
Thanks.
We don't have a lot of time. I prepared a few notes. 10 minutes is all we have. So I won't say too much because I prefer the Q&A, the kind of call and response and conversation. But I want to start my talk with a quote from one of my favorite artists, Frederick Sommer, the photographer. And he said, "Poetic logic is a sensuous apprehension of what we don't yet understand in the presence of reality." So I'll say it one more time because it's kind of loaded. Poetic logic is a sensuous apprehension of what we don't yet understand in the presence of reality. So what I love about that is that as an artist, I'm always operating like somewhere between what I know and what I don't know. So there's a kind of sense of asking questions by way of making art. And the kind of philosophy that how can you do something new if you know what you're doing drives a lot of my own work. So there's a sense of risk in that. When Marina talked about her work last couple weeks ago, I loved how she talked about how art means a lot of things. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do with my work too, to create pieces of work that are suggestive, poetic, that kind of guide the viewer to have their own emotional, imaginative, suggestive responses. So in that way, it doesn't mean anything per se. It's not like didactic and telling you how to think about anything. I was thinking about Matt's work and how I love, kind of Nikki said it too, like how I felt the same way that maybe that you did, Nikki, that they function so well as objects. That for me, I started thinking about animals. I started thinking about dunce caps, gnome hats, and yet they're also this kind of beautiful organic minimalist form. So I love that it doesn't mean any one thing. That when you start to see people put it on and they start getting awkward with them, it starts to function the way that Matt described it. Like it starts to change the way space is used. So for my work here, and this is really all I want to say about it, is that I started in around 2021 during the lockdown, the pandemic lockdown. And since that time, really before that time, but even more since that time, I've been thinking about how our most cherished cultural institutions, they kind of seem to be more and more vulnerable, more and more unstable, more and more kind of marked by internal decay. And so issues such as structure and decay, form and formlessness, stability and instability define the work that you see here and here. So these are studies for a larger series that this is the start of. That hopefully I'll finish within the next couple of years because I've got a lot of projects going on. But yeah, so that's kind of all I want to say. So if you have questions, I'd love to have a conversation with you.
What are they made of, Corey?
They're collages, so they're toner print paper on black backboard. And they're collages from photographs that I made. So yeah, so the photographs I made, I installed into a Word document. And then I ran it through a kind of a crappy printer to change the registration to kind of lower the quality of them. And I had the photographs, there's probably about 50 photographs, and then I cut and collaged them together in these shapes. I can say more. I'm a very verbose person, but I really would rather have a conversation. Because I think art is about conversation. I think the meaning of art occurs in the conversation that we have, even if it's just with ourselves, right? But one of the things I love to do the most is to talk about art in the classroom or when I go see art with friends. It's like one of the most enjoyable things for me. So you can ask me anything. Yeah?
Well, I'm curious about the overall shape and what sort of connects them.
Yeah, I was thinking about how might you articulate an institution, right? And so I hesitate to talk too much in detail about this because I don't want it to sound like this is what it means, right? But I started thinking about, okay, fundamental institutions, how architecture reflects institutions, fundamental shapes, how the basic three shapes within designs, like fundamental shapes, a triangle, circle, and a square, can be combined in different forms to create variations of a theme, but that they still kind of retain the kind of fundamental quality of those shapes. So really, for me, it was like maybe a nod to architecture, especially skyscrapers, things like that. And I was inspired, I love talking about inspiration too, like other artists that influence me. That's not something I shy away from at all. So Bernd and Hilla Becker, do you know the photographers Bernd and Hilla Becker? There's a recent show, I think, was it the Met? I think it was at the Met recently. That is a fantastic show of typologies of industrial buildings that they took photographs of over the course of their marriage and their partnership. Yeah. So I was looking at a lot of Becker's work, and I was looking at people like Hercules Stagers, who was a printmaker around the time of Rembrandt, Max Ernst, artists like that.
When I look at them, Corey, I see that reference and I think it's working to institutions, but before Marina brought it up, I felt like I was looking through a keyhole and like peeping in, and then when you start talking about losing institutions, I'm like, oh no, we can't make them out, and what if they're, like I do see that chaos, and with that stark black background, it's like, I don't get to go there.
Yeah, I like that they become portals in that way. That they become, there's almost a positive negative reversal. The space gets kind of shifted. In some cases, when you look closely at them, I think the surface is there. But I think more so you look through them. And I think it's because of the kind of photographic quality of the patterns. That may be part of that. Yeah. Yeah, Rachel.
I remember seeing your show downtown and then also seeing your work here, and I noticed that you work in books a lot, or like cereal, and that's something
something that you think about that's part of the ideas behind it?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really is something. I love variations on the theme. I think when you limit yourself to a certain structure or a certain practice, there's this kind of way that it pushes your creative response. So instead of kind of having every option available to you, you limit that. And to me, that's creative problem solving. How do I like get the most out of this? And you know, in this case, like there's only going to be what 12 possibilities, and so you know, but how you can kind of also create great diversity within this limitation. So yeah, that's I would say almost in every project I engage in, there's limitation like that and seriality like that. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I sort of like the idea. I thought those were completely abstract, but now you said you've kind of all these hundreds of pictures and made a collage out of them. And I like the idea of you're looking through a window and you can see everything. You can see the whole world out through the window or something like that.
Oh,
that's a neat idea.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yes. You know, it's interesting to take pictures of the world and then, you know, because this is real stuff, right? Photographs are real stuff, but to try to somehow camouflage that, so that you're not really sure what it is, but it feels real. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. And you mentioned that this is a nod to architecture, and once you said that, I can see that. Especially, they look like obelisks almost, like made out of some kind of marble-like material.
Yeah, it's great. You know, I think if there's like a seed to this work, it was way before the pandemic, and I happened to be lucky enough to be traveling around Italy and seeing some of the marble columns that especially in Venice, and the way that the hard geometry of those columns contains the atmosphere, the veininess, the chaos of the grain of the marble was totally fascinating to me. And you can see it even in those like granite countertop stores, right? You have this like rectilinear slab cut, and inside of it is the marbling of the stone. So I think that dynamic was in the back of my head for a really long time, and waiting to find a place to get out. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, Rachel.
Yes, this is more of a comment. Something I really enjoy about the larger pieces is like this connection between photography and painting, and I don't know if this is part of the work, but in my mind connects art history like Barton Newman and the zip and that like precipice of something.
Yeah.
Possibility of something and what it could be, or it could be multiple things. So my mind like connects that thought.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I love that. I'm flattered. You know, the sublime is something that I'm interested in as an artist, and so the reference to Newman is particularly right. Yeah. So you know, that's the kind of sense of awe. You know, the kind of sense of being astonished. Yeah.
Well, and just to add on, I saw the same thing too, especially with my background as a photographer. But you mentioning your quote and her like the vectors and like seeing that and hearing that, I'm like, oh yeah, that's on purpose, which is also, I love that. Like it's like I see it, but sometimes I also am like, am I making stuff up? So it's nice to hear that was part of your thought. Well, thank you so much, Corey. If y'all have more questions, hang around and ask Corey questions. But thank you so much.
I just want to echo Corey's sentiments and thank Lene and Abigail and GOCA for hosting us. And when I first walked into the space, I was like, holy cow, this show looks awesome. And I was just feeling so proud to get to show my work alongside my incredible colleagues who, like Corey said, we don't see each other that much, so sometimes you don't know what's going on. You walk in, you're like, look at Claire Rao, the superstar, and it's just like, I didn't know about Nick's history with his father and the tire shop, so it's really is a privilege to get to be around such incredible artists and colleagues, and knowing that we're educating people. Like I have a sense of like real pride in the space, and I think this show kicks ass. You can believe that video. So this sculpture is actually a side note to the bigger artwork that is the performances, which you can witness by video or also by the website. And I've been straddling a studio practice and a public art practice for about the last decade. It started. And the big thing, if I'm going to drop a little bit of academic prowess, is that I was trained in relational aesthetics, which asks, the aesthetics and relational aesthetics shifts from the beauty and the preciousness of that and asks instead, like, what can the art do? And in my case, that a lot of times that's service or community oriented. And so there was a prompt that came out, a part of a bigger conversation that actually later, a year later, exploded with Black Lives Matter. And the conversation is about how people were getting disgruntled about the public art that was no longer representing their community. And in some cases, as you've all seen and read, downright racist and inappropriate, to the point where public across the world were ripping down sculptures, and cities were starting to responsibly remove them and go, oh yeah, that, like, a Confederate statue might not make sense for the public, if it ever did. So Black Cube Nomadic Museum in Denver put out a call and said, so what would you do? If you were gonna make a monument for the city of Denver, what would you do? And so I was like, well, what I do? This is a good conversation, you know? Like, our sculptures and our public art isn't serving the public. So I was like, well, and they had this plinth. They had this big picture, like, what would you put on this plinth? And I was like, so I was like, I would put a golden staircase in front of it, and then I would invite anyone to be on the plinth. And then my idea was that, like, everything and everyone is art. And so I took that to, they liked that idea enough that they were like, all right, Nikki, we can't exactly do that because of liability and 1 million, like, rules in the world. They're like, and I was like, you guys already have the insurance, because I've done enough guerrilla artwork and things. I'm actually quite well protected because I do things that are, because I wear the hat into the restaurant. And so they said, we can't just let anyone up there. And if we do that, it's a major liability. It was right outside the Denver Performing Arts Center and the Convention Center in Denver. So I said, okay, well, then why don't I hire people? I'll hire the people who I know who have the least amount of money that are cultural laborers. And they're like, yes. And like, and by the way, don't affiliate us with that, because when your sample doesn't represent everyone, then we can point at you. And I was like, great. So I went through and kind of like asked around, who are the people who need the money the most? And my idea was about taking this money that normally gets spent on statues and putting it in the pocket of people making art today. So that's what I did. And so the artists you'll see in there got the funding that was supposed to go into some kind of monument. Well, then they were like, there's a problem. And I was like, what? And they're like, we can't have like a queen-size bed plinth empty when there's no performances. So we can't just leave this in front of the convention center. And I was like, well, just give me a week. Like, in 1 minute, I was like, it'd be hilarious if we put traffic cones on it. It'd be real hard to sleep, but then we can make fun of the city trying to control where we go, right? Like a plinth is not a problem for a sculptor, but give me a week to come up with an idea. And so I came up with the We the Privilege, which is borrowing, downright stealing Robert Indiana's Futura font, the I Heart You in Philadelphia. And but then of course I'm correcting the institution to who really is voting and who really has a say. And, you know, people who have the privilege of being literate even. So then I was like, well, and I had a few ideas. It was like, we, the privilege. The other one was everybody. Everybody, like, including all you, but also guess how we discriminate against each other? By your body, by like how you look. And so it was like connecting and disconnecting, and they liked this one. So then we had to find all the money, and they went to the big boss, and they're like, all right, how much do you need? And then this got made to fill the plinth when there were no performances. So that is, I felt like this was the most appropriate work I have right now to show, because a few UCCS alumni are featured, some hotshots around town. Actually, Sue has now gone off to the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. So, but Jasmine Dillaboo, who's like running the performance art scene here now in Colorado Springs, is also, so I got to work together with UCCS grads, and they're my peers now. And I think of my students as my peers, 1 year from being my peers. Like, so excited to follow, like it's time for you to lead now in the arts, and it's my turn to follow. So I'll stop there because Lene said I have 5 minutes, and I'd rather hear what you have to say than what than this. So this was featured downtown in Colorado Springs later at the Pioneers Museum. So yeah, Domino.
So I came and visited the gallery on Monday too, and immediately, I loved everything here, but immediately this is what stuck out to me, because it just struck me about how many ways that I am privileged. I think you might know this already, but my girlfriend is an epilepsy survivor, and she advocates for it, and that's where my mind went when I looked at this immediately. It really called me out and just made me kind of collect my thoughts and experiences and just think immediately, what are the ways throughout my daily life and growing up throughout my childhood that I was able to have a good one and experience it well while she was in Children's Hospital getting an EEG. And it kind of cracked through and made me vulnerable. I think it's very, very effective at that.
Well, you made me think, Domino, while you were sharing that, is that every single person that I invited, I was like, I'm going to highlight your minority status in a field, and I'm putting you on stage to show that you're obese or to show that you're a female or Puerto Rican, to try to give the stage to the underprivileged. And of course, I made sure people understood that you're here to represent the non-privileged, not just financially, but visually. You'll be discriminated against, hopefully celebrated. But yeah, I say it all the time in class. Like, it's a privilege to be here. It's a privilege to work with you. Yeah.
So people can actually climb the stairs?
They scratched the stairs. Okay. Yeah, we had a ladder for the performers to get up, but that was just the idea. It was like, I'm not going to put a sculpture there. I'm going to put an invitation for people to be. And my idea was like, I'm going to have cash in my pocket, and I'm going to be like, hey, sir, would you like to have a picnic on? I'll give you some cash if you just display real life on the stage. And then the curators were like, no, we got to work on that.
How is this physically made?
Yeah, this is steel, and then it's painted, and so I work with welders, and then automotive Bondo, so people who are experts at making a perfect shape on top of steel, and then it's automotive paint. And the hardest part, which I witnessed, but I did not do, was masking off to paint the gold. And getting this edge, where if you look closely, you can see how tricky it is. I don't know if you've ever taped off a wall and tried to paint. It's just like impossible to get that. Yeah.
I hate to say that I enjoyed the piece, because saying I enjoyed it isn't really enough to attach to this piece. But it really made me think about the privileges that I've received in my life, especially like you said, being literate, being able to read, being able to write. I think this is just a really powerful piece.
Thank you. Yeah.
The coloring, the privileges in gold, kind of showing that non-essential, and it being made of steel, like a foundation aspect. And what I kind of picked was when you're separating that aspect with these privileges. So it's you took that aspect and the we being black, kind of showing the color, because it could have been any other color, but you picked one of the most stereotyped.
I couldn't get it more gold. I was trying to get it more gold. But does it need the black face, or could it be gold all the way? Would it still read strongly?
I don't think so. Yeah.
Ben, did you have a question?
No, I was going to say, I was at one of the performances in Denver, and you were talking just now, and it struck me there was this moment of the violin player struggling to get on and off plinth, which seems like an important part of one of the performances, where there are no stairs, and you did not use a ladder. At least I don't remember that being shared.
We had the option, but Bruce was like, people will, so my friend Bruce, and maybe the person who has the least access to money or winning wages, brilliant artist, I said, Bruce, you're a gay man. He's like, I'm a gay white man. I don't have anything to say. Nobody needs to hear from me. And I was like, yeah, but your size. He was like, yeah, okay, I'll do it. And he was like, but if I'm going to do it, people are going to watch me struggle getting up and down. And he's like, it will be hard for me because of my knees. And so yeah, when you saw them belly up and I'm there, you know, and like that is one of the most major discriminations we do is by size. It seems so absurd when I say it, right? Like, how can we even consider that when we're looking at humans? But yeah, that was a devastating moment. And you'll see it, but then Bruce, who is like orchestra symphonically trained, performed John Cage's. So it's pure silence, the 4-minute 13. Is it 4 minutes 12?
33.
4 minutes 33. So is that time?
Yep. But thank you so much for telling us more about this work. It's nice to hear more about the history of it and kind of how you pick the artist that you're working with, and the actual sculpture, which become, you know, in our minds, I think the physical object is like, that's the art, but it's like, that's such a secondary thought in this whole piece. So it's nice to kind of hear the like process of how that develops.
Well, at this question, maybe I'll leave you with it, not to answer here, but like, where does this belong? I'm like, I want it to go, and where does it exist as like an accountability for privileged people? So if you figure it out, email me, and I'm going to go try to sell it to them for triple the money and get it away.
Thank you so much, Nikki.
Thank you guys for coming. So I will try to keep this brief, but this is artifacts, I would say. I was telling Corey the other day, it's the only second time in my life I framed something and put it on the wall. I don't normally make things in a gallery. Usually the work I make takes place out in the world in some way, and that actually is what is true with this project also. And these are kind of artifacts, visual and sonic evidences of a larger piece called Tree Talks, which has been a 3-year project. It wasn't supposed to be 3 years. COVID made part of that longer than it needed to be. But this whole thing, I can talk about the pieces, and then I also will announce the final component because it's almost finished. It's going to be finished next Friday, March 24th, with an event up in Denver. Also, Black Cube Nomadic Museum that Nikki mentioned was a funder, producer of this project. I also got a grant from the CRCW committee through UCCS to fund the part of this project. But the larger idea was really inspired by my involvement in the world of mycology, which is the study of mushrooms. I'm an amateur mycologist. I've been part of that world for a while. When I was living in New York City, I learned initially with a really amazing mycologist teacher named Gary Linkoff, who actually wrote the Audubon Guide for North American Mushrooms, which is like a staple. He also co-founded the Telluride Mushroom Festival, which happens every summer in Telluride. He's really influential in that world, and a lot of artists were also part of that. Nikki just mentioned John Cage. John Cage was a part of that founding of that club back in the late 50s. So mushrooms have been inspiring me in my life and in all sorts of ways and kind of finding their way into my art practice for a while. And Gary had this quote, actually he passed away a couple years ago, and I visited his gravestone, I think it was in 2018, in the Bronx. And he has this quote of his engraved on his headstone that inspired this project. And he says, "No tree is an individual, all are communities of organisms changing throughout the life and death of a given tree. A tree is a microcosm of all the kingdoms of life. Know a single tree thoroughly, and you know more about life and evolution than any world traveler can ever hope to attain." And I was really thinking about this idea and then thinking what happens if I actually tried to make that a reality in some way. And so this project, I'm thinking about this as the first in a series of projects of studies of given trees, of a single tree species. So Tree Talks, the first one was focused on Populus tremuloides, which is the aspen, and I thought that was a good choice for being in Colorado. And so over the course of a year, I organized 4 events, one each season, to take place in an aspen grove at the top of Kenosha Pass, which is about 2 hours from here, between here and Denver, on the way to Morrison. And on each one, I curated a select group of people to talk about the aspen from different cultural and scientific perspectives. So I've had to write it all down here, but we had speakers included a U.S. Forest Service aspen researcher, a mycologist, a poet, a certified deep listener, that was M.J. Sullivan, who was part of BAPA, who passed away last year, led us on a really amazing deep listening walk, an ornithologist, a dendrochronologist, who studies how
what you can learn from looking at the rings of a tree, not just the years, but what else can we learn from that. An archaeologist, a certified forest therapy guide, an Oglala Lakota artist and activist, an installation artist, Elaine right here was part of that. A composer and electronic musician, Ido Aroni from Colorado College, and his contribution was, you can hear on these headphones here. An entomologist and a geographer, somebody, Brandon Vogt, also from UCCS, who studies lightning. Trying to think about how can we actually learn, right, what can we learn about something, right? We can learn from someone telling us the scientific knowledge that we've learned from studying the tree, but then how can we also learn about this place through like being there, feeling it, smelling it, being present in that space? And so trying to like really think about how we can build knowledge in a really kind of larger sense. And so these are a couple of photographs. So I had each event photographed. We also went in the winter. It was like at the top of a mountain pass in winter with snowshoed in. We were there in like bad conditions. We were there for a storm was rolling in. We felt the like change of the atmosphere. So it was about being there, learning together, being present together with the trees over the whole seasons. I also recorded sounds from all of these events. So what you see here are some evidence. This was a scan of one of the stumps that one of the speakers took and dated for us. This is a photograph of Christine Bierman, who runs the UCCS Tree Ring Lab. Took a core sample, and then we can talk about what we can learn from that. Not just age, like I said, but like how we might be able to learn about human impact many, many years ago through just studying the core sample. So I thought this was a beautiful image. This was taken by Danny Mullaney, who photographed for the events for me. That's just the core sample on the tool in front of snow. I love how the visual, like these two, like the circle and the point kind of worked as an visual artifact. Ido's piece with the sound was actually, he took a contact microphone and connected it to the tree and then processed it live. So we brought out all his battery-powered PA system, and we actually had him sample sound from the actual tree and then perform that for us. And then these are, you can take one of these, please. These are two-sided posters that are actually, this is a performance shot of Ido in the trees performing, and then another shot of someone walking through the grove. These are actually going to be folded posters that are a part of the final piece of this project, which is a record. So the final piece is a sound work that is about 36 minutes long, and it's going to be released next Friday up at Black Cube, and it's a vinyl. So I had it pressed on vinyl. I can pass this around if you want to look at it. So then another way, a final way, is kind of like, I was thinking it's going to come with this booklet with snippets of all the lectures, images from the events, a poster, so you can sit with this and really listen. This is sort of like a deep sound dive into the space. There's a little bit of voice. MJ makes her way on here with her vocal prompts for deep listening. Part of this sound is on here as well. And so like for me, it was the talks, it was the events, all of those are now up online, and you can listen to those talks if you want, but then there's also this kind of more experiential sound work that goes along with it. And if anyone's interested, next Friday up at Black Cube in Denver, from 6 to 8 p.m. we're having a listening event where we'll listen to the whole thing, and there'll be the record release will be available for sale. It's a limited edition, and these are actually made through a lathe cutting process, which is kind of interesting. Each one is hand kind of engraved. So I'm going to pass that around, and then I guess that there's probably lots of questions now.
You made me think how a record is like the tree ring, which I never ever thought about in all these years of thinking about objects.
And I guess thinking about the record, right, like why a record? It comes with a digital download and all that, but for me, I was also inspired by Folkways records. I've always collected those records, and they always it would be like sounds of the American Southwest, and it would be field recordings of a place with a booklet of information about what is that frog. It tells about the species and what we're hearing in that landscape. So you really sit with it and you like intently listen to this thing and you learn something from that, but through sound and through text. Mm-hmm. So I was trying to, that was one of the inspirations, but like I have a Folkways album that sounds at the junkyard, and it's like, this is a 1942 Ford F-150 engine being cut through with an acetylene torch. I'm like, wow! Like, right? Sounds like complete garbage, of course. And so I was like, I just like that experience, so that's why the record form for me came out of that. Yeah.
What are the cutouts in the log? Tree ring?
That was a dead tree, so I think that's probably, insect spores or just, yeah. Yeah, I think she took it was a fallen tree and she took a sample for us to pass around and kind of think about. Yeah, I love the way these just became, I just kind of, I don't know, this whole thing took so long that I had all these images and I was just kind of sitting with them for a while and I thought this made a nice kind of diptych.
It's resonant.
Yeah.
It reminded me of, do you remember when Bjork made a, what do you call that spinning thing? Music box out of glass.
Oh, yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
It's always, when you have to take your work out in the world with so many components to bring it in here, like how do you capture that? Like, it's great to do sound and images and then a takeaway.
Yeah, it is always a challenge for me to put things in the gallery and how does that work? And it was just in process. It's, like I said, it's not even done yet, right? But I thought that was also a fun way of kind of presenting some of the process along the way. Yeah.
I have an incredibly inarticulate question.
That's okay.
So I'm really interested in relations between science and art. And Corey mentioned the poetic logic, which is sort of not exactly anti-science, but it does have threads that go there. And you're working with both. And I'm always interested to see successful collaborations that don't negate each other. Because I mean, it's very easy for one to, well, science doesn't spend a lot of time criticizing art, but, and so I wondered if you had any thoughts along those lines about how you approach that, or do you even think about that?
Since my interest in mycology has kind of taken over my brain, I think about that a lot. I also, something you said made me remember, one of my favorite artists and musicians, Brian Eno, had a speech he gave in 1995 or 1996. It was for the Turner Prize, the year Damien Hirst won the prize. And his speech was really kind of critical of the art world at the time, saying like, we need to be better at communicating art's importance in the world because the sciences do that pretty well, right? With like pop science and books and things, he said with like book sales of like these types of sciences, science books, we see that that's working and that the public really is able to understand, grasp big, hard ideas, right? And he's like, but the artists pride themselves on being like opaque and like not letting anyone understand things and being kind of mysterious. And he was kind of saying if we want arts to be valued and funded, we need to do a better job at communicating art's value. That's not really an answer to your question, but that's what I was thinking about.
It's an interesting tangent.
Yeah. But I think for me, I was also thinking about how do I make something that's not didactic, and in the end, it's like experiential, and that took a long time to kind of, I don't know, it was a process, and I didn't know what I was making. I recorded all this, so I recorded the talks, and I knew that was going to be on an archive. But the sounds, I just recorded all sorts of sounds, lots of different microphones, contact microphones, stereo microphones. Like I was like in an anthill. I made some like Planet Earth-like sounds, like with a stereo or the contact mic in an anthill. And I had all this stuff. I was like, what do I make? And the form kind of found itself eventually. But I let the process kind of just emerge.
No, it addresses it.
Okay, thanks.
All right, last comment. Yeah.
I kind of like a continuation a bit of this conversation, but I'm really interested in like when you have an idea at the onset, how you reach out in your own practice to like scientists or people outside of the arts disciplines. And I struggle with this in my own practice. And my mentor in graduate school also was like, you know, you have to find the weirdos that are willing to listen. Like, how do you get there?
I've told people before that my art practice is more like an office job where I spend more time on email than anything else. I reach out to a lot of people for this. I was lucky to find a really interesting group of people that understood, right? Oh, I see, this is interesting. Yes, I want to be a part of that. But a lot of, I thought it was interesting, not to like knock anyone, but a lot of scientists that I reached out to like,
oh, I can't possibly speak about that because I only study this very particular type of grass that is in the, and I was like, but you can't connect that to the larger ecosystem in some way, like that makes, okay. But they were just like, they could not see a way that they could fit into that. I could, right? But it did take a lot of reaching out and a lot of people saying no and finding the right people. But you're right, I think it is finding the weirdos who can kind of see broadly or see how it's okay if it's not exactly about aspen because we're in a grove and there's insects in the grove. And we could talk about that, right? It wasn't a scientific paper, but that's not what I was trying to make, right?
Well, thank you so much, Ben.
So the work I have in the show here is something that's actually a work in progress, titled It Met Your Spec. And I guess I'll backtrack to talk a little bit about my studio practice. I'm an interdisciplinary artist, so meaning I work in a variety of different materials, usually lens-based, so photography, time-based media, and new media. And I'm really interested in utilizing the lens in a way to kind of investigate crossovers between ecofeminism, technology, and wilderness space. I'm also a trained naturalist in this other life, which means like you go out into natural space and you catalog plants or animals and taxidermy. So that often does like come into my work as well. And in my work, I'm really interested in integrating humor, like quiet humor, in moments, beauty, and trying to reach different audiences, and also using the fantastic, so like science fiction is a big inspiration for my work. So science fiction being the space where you can reimagine other ecologies. I'm really interested in non-human spaces, so spaces or ecologies that could exist before human existence or after human existence. And not in this work, I would say specifically, but often in my practice, I work between my studio space, in my home, a dark room, color and black and white dark room, and then also the landscape. So when I'm not at work, usually during summer semesters, doing residencies or going and traveling off, being quite nomadic and going into extreme landscapes, and those kind of spaces being jumping off points for my own kind of constructed fictions. The work that you see here is something I actually started last summer. It was on hold for a while. I was pregnant. For some of you, there's some students here that saw me in that state, but I was actually physically unable to do a lot, so this work is on hold, and it's been really fun to actually now get back into this work and be able to like physically make work again. So it's something that's in progress. It's something that I'm working on right now, and the prints were originally silver gelatin prints. They use cameraless photography and darkroom montage techniques. My work is also very experimental, and that word can be thrown around a lot, but for me it means like disrupting, like paying homage to the tradition or knowing your craft, but also disrupting the tradition or the craft of something as well, and the long history of disrupting tradition and montage and things like that. So using cameraless photography montage, the imagery that I combined is like photography that I've taken myself and then cut up. So domestic tools, plants, body parts, and I maintain also like a large collection of like paper ephemera. And so like I have this collection of science magazines from the 60s and 70s that often inspires my work and actually inspires the titles of each piece. So the titles are like a little bit tongue-in-cheek, have double meaning. But like way back in 2006, I did an apprenticeship at a natural history museum in Boston. And the lab for that was in this World War I bunker underground where students do like animal husbandry and stuff, so like really interesting space. And one day, the school was getting rid of all of their 1960s and 70s science magazines, which for like an artist, they were just like a giant like garbage pile. I enjoy garbage picking. Like a giant garbage pile of these retro magazines was like, you know, like, let me get these, and just having them in the back of your mind always and looking at them, and being really interested in the advertisements. So the advertisements were like really bizarre, like I don't even know what they're for. Scientific experiments, space exploration, how the language of those ads, the language of like survivalist tools that are gendered for like Swiss Army knife and things like that versus like domestic or women's home magazines, and how the machines are gendered or targeted for a specific audience, how that compares and contrasts. So the titles are inspired by kind of the lingo that you see in some of those advertisements and playing with that. So like creating my own kind of visual vocabulary, and that also coinciding with this also experience of like body transformation related to pregnancy, like personally, that being kind of like a horrific experience, having medical fears, personally, the domestic responsibilities that come from that while being someone who's an artist and having a career, and then that paired with this larger conversation and larger fears that are going on, I would say, politically in this country at this time. You know, can I travel to Utah to go to the national park in July of 2022? Maybe not. So, you know, how your body is being controlled and how that relates to this kind of like separation of selfhood and like machines, and then the machines that you use in the domestic space. And they're GOCA prints, so they're digital prints that are made, they're enlarged from the original silver gelatin. Usually I work pretty large, but like access to resources, right, and space is something, like thinking about Nikki's work in privilege, like having access to this space is really wonderful. And for students to have access to resources. So, you know, usually I work pretty large. This I did digital prints in order to have them larger for the show here. But yeah, something I'm working on as well, so feedback is definitely welcome.
Could you read the titles?
Yeah, so this one, they all start with like, it met your spec, ... It met your spec, simplified, simplified operation, sensitive detection. The blender is automated for unattended. The hands with the like phallic flowers are magnetic fields, and then the Tupperware arm is without attachments. And like the last one, actually, like I haven't done it yet, but I really want to make a costume out of like 1980s Tupperware. Something for the future.
Can you talk a little bit about, because you're talking about cameraless photography, but you have hands in these first two that I'm assuming are shadows of your own hands in the darkroom, and then you have like kind of the printed hands from the advertisements. And
so they're actually not printed, they're on my hand, and actually I never have long nails. So like this summer, I was like, okay, how long could I get my nails to grow so that they look like they, like I was looking at a lot of like toaster, Tupperware parties and stuff like that from like advertisements, like, okay, how can I get my hands to not look like crap? Like, you know, like I painted them, I knew they would be in black and white, so I painted my nails black, and then, so all the imagery you actually see here is original photography that was then montaged together. But I look a lot at like the advertisement references to be like, okay, what was the gesture? How do I make my hand look like ultra feminine for like making the connections to these like old magazines?
You definitely fooled me, because I've seen, I love like old 70s ads because there's some like beauty about how ridiculous they are. And I was like, those look like ads.
Yeah, like,
and, yeah.
Almost like these like Renaissance kind of like hand gestures. Yeah.
not so much a question, just something I really like about them is there's like a very mystic quality, like you're kind of searching through time and space for something, especially in the first two. Reminds me of like looking at like a glass ball, I don't know, trying to see something.
Thank you. Yeah, like I enjoy creating a space in my work where like it's timeless, or you don't really know if it's associated with a specific place or location or period of time.
Yeah, because it's all so strange and sort of collaged together, it kind of reminds me of that. It wasn't really a scientific theory, but it was like when science was first beginning, they were like, oh, because these bugs came out of this rotten meat, then the rotten meat must have born, you know, like conceived of the bugs. Does anyone know that? That's what it makes me think of.
Thank you.
I'm getting that, like, retro, almost cultural memory, and this dreamlike quality of the fragmented imagery, where it doesn't really make a narrative, but it's this free association of different images, you know, come together. It feels kind of beyond any specific time that I can place it in.
Yeah, I'm with Matt too. There's almost like a photographic surrealism to it. That it, you know, it feels like it's coming from that era when photography really was pushing the kind of dreamlike qualities that were possible with it. The last one, particularly, I keep coming back to is the kind of science fiction quality of that one. It feels like almost like gold, like classic sci-fi, black and white sci-fi. Yeah, and it's and you talk about like tongue-in-cheekness. There's like a subtle. It seems like a little bit of subtle humor, like a really low. Like you as the more you look at some of them, the more it starts to come to the surface. So yeah, not necessarily like a question, but the dream surrealist dream quality of them, I think, are really fascinating. And the longer you sit with them, I think those kind of that cultural timelessness comes out for sure.
Yeah, I'm a pretty silly person. And yeah, if I have a little chuckle, I'm like, oh, this is kind of funny, but maybe you don't see it right away. But then when you see it, it's like a nail on the head.
Yeah.
Those moments are fun where like maybe if you didn't see this one with that one, you wouldn't get that, but and then the titles,
Yeah, and I didn't see it when I first saw the show, but I'm in a really good spot now to see it kind of, and to hear you and to kind of see them all together, and then having you read the titles just started to, okay, I'm starting to see it now. And that, I love that sense of discovery of a piece of art. When it initially doesn't offer you something, but the longer you kind of chew on it, the more you taste it, you know? Yeah.
Well, and I love the like layering of you on these objects and these artifacts, and this like, I feel like the part you were talking about, like the personal side of it, like that really connects it, where you're inserting yourself into these images. And you know, some of these are like, especially these first two, the object is like, well, what is that? Like, what kind of scientific experiment would you use that thing for? Like, I'm not a scientist, so that is a mystery to me. But it's also like, you find yourself in weird places and do weird things. So I like that kind of layering of you on these images as well. But thank you so much, Rachel. This was, I'd love to hear the feedback. So thank you.
Thank you.